Welcome to the JelatoMinistry podcast, the place where we dive deep into the Word of God and come out transformed. I'm your host, and today we have an episode that literally left me speechless when I was preparing it. We're talking about the most explosive passage in the Gospel of Matthew, the Great Commission, Matthew 28:16-20. And I want to ask you a question before we get started. Do you know why you're still on this earth? Not in heaven, here, right now. The answer to that question is going to change how you see everything. Share this episode, put it out on social media, because this is something the entire church needs to hear. And joining me today, as always, is my brother and researcher, the man who, when he opens his Bible, it's like a lamp gets turned on in the room. Welcome to the episode. Tell me, what has you most excited about this passage today?
Brother, thank you. Look, what has me most excited is this. Many believers know Matthew 28:19-20 almost by heart. They've heard it hundreds of times. But I think most people have reduced it to a missionary slogan. And today, we're going to see that this is not a slogan. It's the climax of an entire gospel. It's the moment that Matthew had been building toward for 28 chapters. Everything he wrote points here. And there's a theological distinction in this passage that I think very few people have seriously considered. And when you see it, it reorganizes your life. The distinction between the motive of the church and the mission of the church. They are different things. And if we confuse them, we can spend our entire Christian life doing good things and still miss the central point. That's what we're going to explore today.
Perfect. Before we dive fully into the text, I need you to give me some context. Who wrote this gospel? Who did he write it for, and when? Because I feel like the historical context of Matthew is essential to understanding why it ends exactly the way it does. And I also want to know, what was the state of the Jewish community at that time? Because Matthew clearly writes for Jews, right? So what does it mean for a first-century Jew to hear what Jesus says in chapter 28?
Great question. Matthew was written probably between 50 and 70 AD, directed primarily to a Jewish Christian audience, believers who came from Judaism and who knew the Old Testament intimately. Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than any other gospel writer, over 60 times. His goal is to demonstrate that Jesus is the promised Messiah. He begins with the genealogy that connects Jesus to Abraham and David, the two great pillars of the promise. Now, for a first-century Jew, the idea of going to all the nations was revolutionary and scandalous. Second Temple Judaism was mostly a centripetal movement. The nations came to Jerusalem. The Gentiles were supposed to come to the mountain of the Lord, drawn by the light of Israel. Isaiah 2 speaks to that. But Jesus reverses the movement. Don't wait for them to come. Go. It's centrifugal. And Matthew, writing for Jews, wants them to understand that this is not a betrayal of God's plan. It is its fulfillment. And there's something archaeologically fascinating here. Studies of the Second Temple period show that there was enormous tension between Palestinian Jews and the diaspora, the Jews who lived scattered among the nations. Palestinian Jews viewed them with suspicion precisely because they lived among Gentiles. And here comes Jesus at the very end of everything, telling them, go to where those Gentiles are. The scandal cannot be overstated.
That's remarkable. I mean, Matthew is writing for people who culturally had a built-in resistance to the idea of mingling with the nations. And Jesus' final command is precisely to go to those nations? That explains so much. It explains why this ending is so powerful, because it breaks with everything the original readers expected. And I imagine that for them it was also a kind of validation, as if God were saying, the promise to Abraham, that in your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed, was always about this. It was always global. Israel was the instrument, not the final destination, right?
Exactly. And that leads us directly to the theological heart of this passage. Genesis 12:3 is the foundational promise. All the families of the earth will be blessed. The Hebrew word mishpachot, which is translated as families or nations, is the same category that appears in Matthew 28 with the Greek term ethne, all the nations. Matthew is deliberately building an ark. Abraham receives the promise, and the risen Jesus gives the command to fulfill it. Keller had a brilliant observation about this. The mission was never for Israel to stay home being holy while the world came to watch them. The mission was always for God's blessing to flow through Israel to the world. Israel was the channel, not the final recipient. And the church inherits exactly that role. We are the channel through which God's grace reaches all nations. The Great Commission is not something new. It is the fulfillment of something very ancient.
All right, now I want us to dive straight into the text. Let's start with verse 16. There's something seemingly simple in that verse, but I think it carries more weight than it appears. The 11 go to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had directed them. Why Galilee? Why a specific mountain? And who was really there?
This is where it gets really fascinating. First, the mountain. Matthew has a theology of mountains. The Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5, the Transfiguration on a high mountain in chapter 17, and now the Great Commission on a mountain in Galilee. Mountains in Jewish thought are places of divine encounter, places of revelation. Moses received the law on Sinai. Elijah encountered God on Horeb. Matthew is saying, this is not a casual meeting. This is revelation from heaven. Second, Galilee. Jesus called this meeting before his death in Matthew 26:32, and the angels confirmed it after the resurrection in Matthew 28:7. It was not accidental. Galilee had the greatest concentration of Jesus' followers. In Jerusalem, according to Acts 1:15, there were only 120 believers. But Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6 mentions that the risen Christ appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. Many scholars identify that appearance with this gathering in Galilee. Just imagine 500 people on that mountain. And third, Galilee was surrounded by Gentile nations. It was called Galilee of the Gentiles. That comes from Isaiah 9:1. It's the perfect setting for a universal commission. Jesus doesn't commission his church in the religious center of Judaism, Jerusalem. He commissions it on the frontier, looking out toward the nations. Geography is theology in Matthew.
Wait. Are you telling me that the very place where Jesus gives the Great Commission is already loaded with prophetic symbolism from Isaiah? That Galilee of the Gentiles isn't just a geographical description, but was almost a signal that Matthew's readers would have recognized? That's incredible. Matthew is operating on multiple layers at the same time. Every detail is speaking. And now, we need to talk about verse 17. Because there's something there that I find extraordinarily honest. It says that when they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. How do you process that? How can there be doubt in that moment?
The honesty of that verse is one of the reasons I trust the historicity of the Gospels. No forger in the first century would have included this note of doubt at the climactic point of his narrative. If someone were inventing a story to make Jesus seem convincing, they would have written something like, "And upon seeing him, they all fell into joyful worship." But Matthew says, some doubted. That's the kind of uncomfortable detail that only the truth includes. Now, what kind of doubt was this? The Greek word is edistason, from the verb distazo, which literally means to be divided, to be of two minds. It's not total unbelief. It's hesitation. It probably arose because Jesus appeared at a distance and gradually drew closer, as verse 18 suggests when it says, Jesus came near and spoke to them. At a distance, on that mountain, with 500 people, it was hard to see clearly. The doubt dissolved as he approached. It's the same dynamic as in Matthew 14, when Peter doubted while walking on the water, and Jesus came near and caught him. And the word for worship here is proskuneo, to prostrate oneself in total reverence. This is the same term Thomas used when he said, "My Lord and my God," in John 20:28. It's not respect for a teacher. It's not honor for a hero. It's worship of God in human flesh, and Jesus accepts it. In the Gospel of Matthew, when men worship other men, there is immediate correction. But Jesus accepts the proskuneo, because he is the one to whom it belongs.
That is devastating in the best possible sense. And notice what that implies for us today. The text doesn't edit out the doubt. It doesn't eliminate it. It leaves it right there in the most glorious moment, right alongside the worship. as if to say, doubt and worship can coexist, and Jesus commissions you anyway. Now we come to verse 18, which for me is where everything explodes. All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. I need you to break that down for me, because I feel like we read it too fast, and we never stop to process what Jesus is actually claiming here.
This declaration is one of the most absolute statements in all of Scripture. The Greek word is exousia, meaning authority, delegated power, the right to rule. And the adjective that modifies it is passa, all, complete, without exception. All exousia. Not most, not a great deal. All. In heaven and on earth. No dimension excluded, no territory outside his jurisdiction. This is the fulfillment of Daniel 7:13-14, where the Son of Man approaches the Ancient of Days and is given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, so that all peoples, nations, and languages would serve him. Matthew wants his Jewish readers to make that connection immediately. The risen Jesus is not making a pastoral suggestion. He is declaring his cosmic enthronement as the sovereign ruler of the universe. Calvin put it this way: Christ declares that by his resurrection, he has obtained lordship over heaven and earth, and that in this way his kingdom has begun. And the phrase has been given to me is crucial. It is passive voice in Greek, edothe. It was given to him. By whom? By the Father. This is the exaltation of the Son after his humiliation. Philippians 2:9 describes the same movement. He humbled himself even to death, which is why God also exalted him. The authority of Matthew 28:18 is the authority of the crucified and risen one, earned through suffering and validated by the resurrection.
The therefore that follows in verse 19 suddenly carries a completely different weight now. It's not a therefore of suggestion. It's a therefore of imperial command. Because I have all authority, therefore go. It's the logic of a king sending out his ambassadors with his authority backing every word they speak.
Exactly. And now we come to the central verb of the entire passage, which most people overlook. In English, we read 4 verbs: go, make disciples, baptizing, teaching. But in the original Greek, there is only one imperative, one single command. And it's not go, it's methodisate, make disciples. The other 3 verbs, go, baptizing, and teaching, are participles. They are the means, the instruments. The central command, the heart of the text, is this: mathetesate, make learners, make followers. The root is mathetes, meaning learner, disciple, someone committed to learning from a teacher and shaping their life according to that teacher's teachings. It's not simply someone who believes certain facts about Jesus. It's someone who actively lives under his lordship. And this appears in Matthew 27:57 to describe Joseph of Arimathea, who had been Matheteutheus, discipled by Jesus. In John 4:1, Jesus' ministry is described as making and baptizing disciples. The command is not to make superficial converts, it is to make committed followers. And here is something Stott pointed out with great clarity. Discipleship in the New Testament is never a church program. It is a life relationship. The rabbi in first-century Judaism didn't just teach in a classroom. The disciple lived with him, ate with him, observed how he responded to difficulties, how he prayed, how he treated those on the margins. It was total immersion. That is what Jesus commands us to produce.
But here comes the most interesting part, and I want us to develop this because it's at the heart of what we're discussing today. Before we talk about how to make disciples, we need to understand the why. And there's a distinction you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that I want you to explain now. The difference between the motive of the church and the mission of the church. Because I feel like this is the key to everything.
Yes, and this distinction is transformative. If we ask most believers what the purpose of the church is, the 3 most common answers are fellowship, teaching, and worship. And listen, all 3 are absolutely essential. They are not optional. Ephesians 1 repeats 3 times, to the praise of the glory of his grace. Ephesians 3:21 says, to him be glory in the church. Worship is central to the very being of the church. But here is the crucial distinction. Those three things are the motive of the church, not its mission. The motive is to glorify God. The mission, the operational objective, the reason we remain on this earth instead of going to heaven already, is to win the lost. And the proof of this is devastatingly simple. Ask yourself, if the purpose of the church were fellowship, why aren't we taken to heaven where fellowship is perfect? If it were teaching, why not to heaven where we would know as we are known? If it were worship, why not to heaven where praise has no imperfections? There is only one theologically coherent reason why God leaves us on this earth after conversion: to seek and save those who are lost. Just as the Father had to send the Son to this fallen earth, not to heaven, to redeem fallen men, we are sent here with that same mission. John 17:18 says it with one powerful word: kathos. As you sent me into the world, so also I have sent them. The kathos expresses an identity of purpose. We do not have a different mission from that of the incarnate Christ.
Wait. That is huge. You are saying that the kathos, the A's of John 17:18, is an equation of purpose. The purpose of Jesus in coming into the world is the same purpose with which he sends us. That is not a comparison of methods. It is a transfer of mission. And so fellowship, teaching, worship, what would their function be in this framework? Are they means or are they ends? Because I feel like there are believers who are going to hear this and say, wait a minute, are you saying that Sundays at church are secondary? I want you to explain this clearly so no one misunderstands.
Perfect question. They are preparation for the mission. They are not the race. They are the training. Packer put it this way: the church exists for two related but distinct purposes: to worship God and to witness to the world. But worship without witness becomes spiritual self-satisfaction, and witness without worship becomes empty activism. The two need each other, but they have distinct roles. There is a powerful illustration from S.D. Gordon that captures this perfectly. He tells the story of a group attempting to climb Mont Blanc. The guide warned them before setting out: "You will only reach the summit if you leave behind everything unnecessary." A young man ignored the warning and carried his blanket, his cheese, his wine, his cameras, his chocolates. The group found each item abandoned along the way. The young man never reached the summit, and Gordon concludes with a phrase that haunts me. Many people, upon discovering that they cannot reach the summit with all their accessories, give up on what is above and pitch their tent on the plain. And the plain is very full of tents. There are believers who have confused camping on the plain of spiritual comfort with climbing toward God's purpose. The church is a spiritual spa rather than as a force for mission.
That hits me deeply, because I think there are entire congregations living on the plateau and calling it heaven. And the problem isn't that they're bad people. It's that they confused preparation with the race. They confused the gym with the game. I want us now to talk about the three elements that the text of Matthew 28 identifies as the necessary attitudes for fulfilling this commission. Let's start with the first one: availability. Because verse 16 simply says, "The 11 went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go." It sounds so simple, but tell me what's behind that.
Availability is the first element, and probably the most underestimated one. Verse 16 says, "They went to the mountain where Jesus had directed them." They obeyed the summons. They went. And what seems trivial is actually the gateway to everything else. These men were not the brightest of their generation. They were not the most educated, the most influential, the most qualified, but they showed up, and because they showed up, they were commissioned. Because they showed up, they received the promise of Christ's presence. Isaiah 6 is the perfect parallel. Isaiah sees the glory of God, recognizes his own unworthiness, a man of unclean lips, and when God asks, "Whom shall I send?" Isaiah says, "Here am I, send me." He didn't say, "First I need to study more." He didn't say, "When I feel more prepared." He didn't calculate the cost. He was available, and that availability was enough for the divine call. Edwards observed that God frequently uses the weak and the stripped away, precisely so that the glory of the outcome cannot be attributed to the instrument. The practical question this verse asks us is direct. Are you available? Not are you talented enough? Not do you have enough theology? Are you available? Is your time, your resources, your talents, your gifts, are they open before the Lord to be used according to His purpose? Because the greatest capacity a person can offer to God is not their intelligence or their ability. It is their availability.
That is both very liberating and very challenging at the same time. Liberating because it removes the excuse of not feeling capable enough. Challenging because it takes away the excuse of being busy. Availability is a decision of the heart, not a matter of the calendar. The second element is worship, verse 17. And we've already explored the word proskuneo. But I want to go further. What does worship have to do with mission? Because for a lot of people, these are two separate things. On Sunday I worship, during the week I do mission. What does the text tell us about the connection between these two?
Worship and mission are not separate activities that take turns. They are two movements of the same transformed heart. A true worshiper sees the world as God sees it, as a field full of people created in His image, loved by Him, and heading into eternity without Him. That vision, generated by genuine worship, produces inevitable missionary urgency. Lloyd Jones used to say that the problem of anemic evangelism in the church can almost always be traced back to a problem of shallow worship. And the text here is careful. The worship that produces mission is not the kind that asks how to be more spiritually comfortable. It's the kind that asks how to exalt the name of Christ in the world, regardless of personal cost. Tozer had a phrase I find definitive. We cannot truly worship God and at the same time ignore the world He came to redeem. Those two states of the heart are incompatible. If worship is genuine, it produces love for the lost. If it doesn't produce that love, something in the worship is not genuine. And there is an additional element in worship that the text implies: purity. David in Psalm 51 connects purity of heart with open witness. He says, "First create in me a clean heart, and then I will teach transgressors your ways." The order matters. First purity, then witness. Worship that includes confession and consecration prepares us to be effective instruments in the mission. We cannot proclaim a Savior whose cleansing we have not personally experienced.
That ties everything together in a very beautiful way. Worship is not the pause before mission. Worship is the fuel of mission. And worship that does not produce love for the lost is incomplete worship, or perhaps worship that is not what it appears to be. Third element, submission. Verse 18. All authority has been given to me. And the text suggests that the appropriate response to that declaration is total submission. But here, I want to explore something deeper. Why does Jesus begin the commission with His declaration of authority instead of going directly to the command? What is the logic of that order?
The order is crucial and completely intentional. Jesus doesn't start with what He wants them to do. He starts with who He is. Because sustained obedience in mission cannot be grounded in emotional enthusiasm or a sense of duty. It has to be grounded in the understanding of who holds absolute authority. If His authority is total, then obedience is non-negotiable and not optional. The declaration of His exousia, His total authority, is the foundation that makes the command unavoidable. Spurgeon put it this way: the reason many believers are inconsistent in mission is that their concept of Christ is too small. When we see correctly who He is, obedience ceases to be a burden and becomes the logical response of someone who has been purchased by His blood and lives under His sovereign rule. Submission is not slavery. It is the rational response of someone who correctly understands the nature of their king. And here is the promise that accompanies the command, verse 20. I am with you always, to the very end of the age. The Greek word is idou. Behold, a particle of strong emphasis. It is not a footnote. It is the central promise. And I am is present continuous tense. Not I will be, I am. Always active, always present, in every difficult conversation, in every border crossed, in every moment of fear before opening your mouth. This is the foundation of submission. You do not face the mission alone.
That strikes me as one of the most beautiful closings of any book in the entire Bible. Matthew begins in chapter 123 with Emmanuel, God with us, and ends with I am with you always. The gospel begins and ends with the same promise. Matthew built that arc deliberately, didn't he?
Completely deliberate. It's a literary inclusio, a device where the author repeats at the end what was said at the beginning to create a unified whole. Emmanuel in chapter 1. I am with you always in chapter 28. The same God present with his people, but now with a universal scope. In chapter 1, it's Emmanuel with Israel. In chapter 28, it's that presence extended to all nations through mission. The name finds its fulfillment in its global reach. And there's something else in that final promise we can't overlook. To the end of the age in Greek is heos tes sunteleas tou ionos, literally until the consummation of the age. This is not a promise for the original 11 who physically heard Jesus on that mountain. It's a promise for every believer who enters into the mission until Christ returns. If you are participating in the mission of making disciples, you have the direct promise of Christ's active presence. It's not a metaphor, it's a guarantee from the King.
All right. I want us to close this analysis with the big theological questions it raises. Because we've seen the Great Commission as the climax of Matthew. We've seen the distinction between motive and mission. We've seen the three elements: availability, worship, submission. But I want to go even deeper. Why does the redemption of a lost sinner glorify God in a particular way? What's the theology behind that?
This is the question that ties everything together. Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:19 says that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. The Greek word katalasso, to reconcile, comes from a root meaning to restore a broken relationship to its original state of peace. And what is restored in salvation is the image of God in the human being that was distorted by sin. Every redeemed soul is a visible demonstration of what God does with what was broken and lost. Edwards had a profound understanding of this. He said that God's glory is manifested in different ways throughout his creation, but that nowhere does it shine with greater intensity than in the act of redemption. Because redemption doesn't only display God's power the way the creation of the universe does, it displays his power over sin, his love toward his enemies, his justice satisfied, and his mercy overflowing simultaneously. The cross brings together all of the divine attributes in a way that no other event in history can. That's why Romans 3:25-26 says that God presented Christ as a propitiation to demonstrate his righteousness. That word demonstrate, indixis in Greek, is a word of public display. The salvation of the lost is the most glorious public display of who God is. Every soul that comes to Christ adds another voice to the eternal choir of Revelation 5, where the redeemed from every tribe, tongue, people, and nation sing to the Lamb. The mission doesn't end in conversions. It ends in eternal worship.
That's extraordinary. Mission and worship form a complete circle. We are sent from worship into mission, and mission produces eternal worship. Revelation 5 is the mission completed. Every nation represented, every tongue worshiping. That is the destination the Great Commission is pointing toward. Before we close, I want us to talk about concrete practical application. Because I believe there are people listening to this who are feeling that weight of conviction, who are asking themselves, where do I fit in this picture? And I need to be honest. When I studied this passage, I asked myself that question about my own time and my own resources. Matthew 6:21 says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." Where is the treasure of most believers today? I think honesty compels us to admit that many of us have set up camp on the plain. We've built comfortable structures of Christian life where fellowship, teaching, and worship are present, but urgency for the lost is absent. And the interesting thing is that we don't feel bad about it because the three things we are doing are good. But we've confused doing good things with doing the right thing.
And here I want to offer something practical and concrete. The text gives us three personal diagnostic questions. First, are you available? Look at your schedule from the last 2 weeks. Was there any space consciously dedicated to reaching someone who doesn't know Christ? It doesn't have to be formal. A conversation, an intentional friendship, an invitation. Was there anything? If the answer is no, then the first attitude, availability, is absent. Second question, does your worship produce love for the lost, or does it produce only personal satisfaction? This is not meant to condemn. It's meant to diagnose. If worship genuinely connects us with the heart of God, we will come out of it loving what He loves, and He loves the lost with a love that took Him to the cross. Piper puts it this way: missions exist because worship does not yet exist among all nations. When the mission is complete, eternal worship will replace it. Third question, and this is perhaps the most uncomfortable one. Are you submitted to the authority of the Great Commission, or have you renegotiated it? Because Jesus did not say, if you feel called, consider the possibility of making disciples when it's convenient. He said, Matthäusate, do it. The command is universal. The recipient is the entire church. The most common renegotiation is, that's for missionaries, for pastors, for those with the gift of evangelism. But the text makes no such distinction. The commission is for everyone who was on that mountain that day, and by extension, for everyone who follows Christ.
Brother, that is a complete examination of conscience in 3 questions. And I want to add something I find very practical. Jesus said in Matthew 6 that where our treasure is, there our heart will be also. Not the other way around. Many people wait to feel it in their heart before they invest. But Jesus says, invest first, and the heart will follow. If you want to love the lost, start investing in the lost. The heart will catch up. You can start with something concrete this week. Write down the names of 3 people you know who don't have a relationship with Christ. Just 3. Put them in daily prayer. Look for an opportunity for a meaningful conversation. You don't need a theological speech. You need intentional presence and genuine love. That is what it means to be available. That is what it means to worship with your eyes open to the world.
And I want to close with this. The promise in verse 20 is not just a promise of comfort. It is a promise of empowerment. I am with you always means we are not going out on our own resources, our own eloquence, our own wisdom. We go with the active presence of the one who has all authority in heaven and on earth. That completely changes the calculation. It is not us convincing people with arguments. It is the Spirit of Christ, present with us, working in their hearts through our witness. That is what made it possible for uneducated Galilean fishermen to transform the Roman Empire in a single generation. It was not their talent. It was the promised presence of the risen Christ. And that same presence is available to every believer who says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." The Great Commission is not a crushing burden. It is an invitation to the greatest privilege in human history, to be ambassadors of the King who holds all authority, carrying the best news the world has ever heard.
What a powerful closing. Brother, this has been one of those episodes you don't forget. Let me summarize what we've seen today. Matthew 28:16-20 is not a motivational verse. It is the climax of an entire gospel. The central command is Matthäusate, make disciples, backed by the full authority of the risen Christ and with his permanent presence guaranteed. The mission of the church is to win the lost, not because fellowship, teaching, and worship don't matter, but because they are preparation, not the destination. The 3 attitudes that make the mission possible are availability, worship, and submission. And the flow is Trinitarian. The Father loved the lost world. The Son came to rescue it. And we are sent to extend that rescue to all nations. That is the Gelato Ministry, going deep into the Word so that we come out transformed in life. If this episode moved you, share it, comment, let someone else hear it, and we'll see you in the next episode.
I just want to leave one final image. Imagine yourself on that mountain in Galilee. 500 people. The risen Christ walking toward you. Doubt turning into worship the moment they recognize him. And then that voice. All authority is mine. Go, make disciples, and I will be with you. That is not a scene from the past. That is the permanent scene in which every believer lives. The risen Christ, with all his authority, sends us today. The question is whether we are available to go. In the next episode, we are going to explore something that I believe will change the way you understand prayer. We are going to dive into one of the most misunderstood texts in the New Testament about how God responds to our requests. It's going to be intense. Don't miss it. May the Lord keep you and send you. Until next time.